I don't know that we found anything that was thoughtfully positive about it.
When he's writing about the adventure aspects, that's when he's like at his best.
Yeah. So he keeps saying this article has this, but it clearly doesn't.
No.
I hate to throw around the L word, but it feels like a lie.
An article called The Lost City That's Not Lost, Not a City, and Doesn't Need to Be Discovered.
Titled Researchers Who Worked Here, and it lists 71 people who worked in the Mesquite region. This undiscovered, unexplored, unresearched region.
How much of this was just lack of research and how much of it was purposeful to make it seem more adventurous? I have to wonder.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Harrenstein, and with me as always is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And this time we are doing kind of a wrap-up to the book we just finished, The Lost City of the Monkey God. But before we do that, I need to do our usual housekeeping stuff, basically. Whether you are watching this or listening to this, please consider giving us a review, like, subscribe, leave us a comment. All that stuff helps us get found so that other people can learn about our podcast and helps us get the word out. Also, if you know of someone you think might enjoy this podcast, please let them know about it. Please share it. Finally, all those things are a wonderful way of supporting us and what we do if you like it, but you can also check the link in the description if you would like to leave us a donation. Small or big, though, any donation can help out if you are able to. So, if you recall, we finished up the Lost City of the Monkey God, the so-called Lost City of the Monkey God, last episode, and we had a few mild criticisms.
I feel like you're, I feel like they were a little bit more than mild, but yes. This
has easily been our most difficult book.
Yes, I would agree.
At least in covering it. Some have been more content difficult, but this one we haven't enjoyed a lot of it.
Right.
So if you were following along, you've heard us go on about how unhappy we are about it for the last 3 episodes. And while that's still going to be us talking this time, we thought it would be good to kind of go to other sources because you've heard our voices. This is an opportunity to hear kind of what other folks are saying. Even though we will still be talking about what they're saying, I will include at least a lot of the links in the show notes. And if there's one that I don't include that you particularly want, just let us know. I'll get it in there. So you can actually check these out yourself if you want to.
Yeah, we essentially wanted to make sure that we were providing as best as possible unbiased information as far as we are concerned. Like, we didn't like the book, but we wanted to hear what other people had to say and include that so that we weren't just shouting into the echo chamber.
Yeah. We wanted to be as fair as possible.
Yeah.
So our task last time was each to find 3 articles talking about the book, and 3 articles each. And then each of us needed to find one. And I'm going to rephrase this a little bit because I said, I think, one article that was positive. Let's rephrase that to be one article that was thoughtfully positive, because I did see some positive things, but it was pretty thoughtless. It was, and not it sounds dismissive, but it kind of is. It was just kind of rehashing what the book said about itself rather than thinking about what the book was saying.
Yeah, no, and I think a lot of that has to do with people's level of understanding with these types of issues that you and I might have. Some people didn't really possibly understand that there was an issue at all.
And sometimes it's the level of journalism involved. Some of the articles, you can tell the journalist put a lot of work into the article, and some of them, you know how internet journalism tends to be, it's just kind of, run it through the door, basically. Yeah. So I definitely a fair few of those. But unfortunately, I feel like we kind of failed all around because we didn't find 3 each. We found way more than 3 each. And I don't know that we found anything that was thoughtfully positive about it. I found a few comments that, we echoed when we were reading it too. But as far as our criticisms, I didn't see someone taking a critical view and coming to the opposite conclusion.
Right. Most of and I know we'll get into this in maybe more detail later, but most of the positive articles and comments and reviews had to do with the adventure aspect. Like, oh, wow, this is such a fun adventure. I know there was one person who didn't even realize this was a real story until about 20% into the book because it was just such an amazing adventure.
Even though the subtitle is a true story.
I know. But, and that is something that we noted and you specifically noted, is when he's writing about the adventure aspects, that's when he's like at his best.
Yeah, that's when I enjoyed his work the most.
But I really couldn't find anything that had any like rebuttal to our criticisms that framed them in a more positive light.
Even his own work or the work of the people who were on the project, they didn't have anything.
Right, yeah.
And we'll talk about that some more. So, okay, so we figured we want to kind of avoid just rehashing all the complaints we had. So we figured we would start with the first critical blog that we found when we were starting reading the book. If you recall, I found it and I was thinking, well, this doesn't bode well, but I'm going to try and hold my judgment until I can see for sure what I think myself, because some of the criticisms I'm not sure I agree with, and we'll get into that. And then we kind of came to the conclusion that the article may have been actually nicer than we are.
Right.
But it's still a pretty good summary of really the major points, major criticisms. And so we figured we would do that and then kind of do a summary of where the problems were in the book. And then the rest of the episode, we're going to try and focus on new pieces of information rather than just the complaints we've already made.
Yeah.
So the blog post is titled, "Did You Even Talk to the Locals?" Subheading, Review of Douglas Preston's The Lost City of the Monkey God by Peter Stanton. This is written in 2023, so it's actually pretty recent.
Yeah.
And I believe, I didn't look into Stanton too much, but I believe Stanton is an author and covers history and culture in Central America region, kind of is one of the things he does. And he had, like I said, kind of the major criticisms we had, but he started off with this line I thought covered things pretty well. "There's plenty of history, archaeology, and other information in The Lost City of the Monkey God that I found to be interesting. I did not regret reading the book. It was a good use of my time as I finished my vacation. However, I was also correct that the book was fishy. Preston may have written a book that includes interesting and important information, but he framed his book in a sensationalist, narrow way that was more focused on appealing to readers than on telling a fair and complete story. To put it in the strongest terms I can, The Lost City of the Monkey God is a shockingly contemporary example of indigenous erasure that takes a deep, unserious approach to academic scholarship." So essentially after that, he starts talking about why he thinks that, which is it's how you develop a good argument and well laid out.
And I think he breaks it down really well and in a way that's kind of easily digestible. 3
main points. So his first section is just titled Indigenous Erasure. So he talks about things we covered as well. He says he's got some more specific numbers than we did because we kind of came across things as we came across them. But he noticed there's very little history about the region and other cultures involved. That was our big, we were a little perplexed at the beginning of the book in particular on that one.
And I think even if you are not an archaeologist and you're just reading this as, a non-professional, that would still be interesting. And I think it would add to the dimension of the book.
Yeah.
So I just don't understand why he wouldn't have added more of the history, especially at the beginning to kind of set the stage. That's how you write.
Right. I feel like, well, I'll save this for a little later, but I feel like I have a sense, perhaps I'll say, in Preston's mind, perhaps talking about all the stuff we know about the culture there before they do their expedition would have undermined how unknown the area and the culture was.
You can't really say you discovered something after talking about the entire history.
I don't know but that would explain, because it is out of order for what you expect.
Yeah.
You'll hear us do this. We've heard us do this for the last 3 episodes. You'll hear us do it this time, comparing this to stealing history.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a while since we read it, but we start off with his personal experience going with some looters. And then in the chapter or 2, he does kind of a deep dive into the culture and the history of the area.
Right.
And our author for this post notes that we don't get any Honduran history until page 53, chapter 7.
Yeah.
And that is just the banana history, which we noted. The people doing the crime to Honduras in that situation are the main characters. Honduras and the people of Honduras are kind of secondary.
Right.
Which is a weird take. He notes the first indigenous person or Honduran is mentioned on page 32. And it's actually a quote from a white explorer. It's not actually, talking to a person. He also complains about the extensive backgrounds that a lot of people got, which we did a lot, because it was, if you recall, it was weird because here's a person and here's how his bus driver in college was a member of the Hells Angels.
Yeah.
Like, what the heck is the point of that?
It was he did have a tendency to go off on all sorts of weird tangents, but I found those to be the most distracting.
They were frustrating because
Yeah.
it didn't seem like it was good.
Right.
Not because like it personally offended me. Although the way this becomes relevant to his indigenous erasure argument is only one person of native or Honduran background got a similar treatment.
Yeah, and it was brief in comparison.
Right. He complains a lot about how the indigenous soldiers are unnamed, which is fair. We did a bit, but not as much as this author, I think. He complains about the "I know soldiers" slur, which we definitely caught too.
Yeah.
If you recall, there was a concern about the site being looted, and they wanted to excavate even though it was not legal.
Right, and the British ex-military guy
who was there for security.
Yeah, was worried that the soldiers were going to loot the site, and he said, quote, "I know soldiers."
Right.
Meaning he knows that they're probably he in his mind knows, with quotes, that they're going to loot.
The thing again, I'm surprised at how much of we're in sync with this author too sometimes, because he notes that Preston just leaves it at that.
Yeah.
And he doesn't come back to it and say that looting didn't happen until much later in the book. Whereas he knew right then and there, at the point of writing that book, whether or not looting had happened, and he should have taken a moment to take us aside and say, no, actually, this is what we found. If he needed to include that at all, which I'm not sure he did.
He didn't have to, really. And I think I'm going to quote the author here because he sums it up really well. He says, Preston provides no immediate follow-up to this claim with evidence that confirms or denies it, resulting in a slanderous implication against the indigenous soldiers that goes unanswered. Only much, much later in the book does Preston state that the British man's predictions did not come true. No looting had taken place.
And the only criticism I recall that he said was one of the soldiers had dug something up because he wanted to look at it, which, fair.
Well, and I'm like, he has more right to do that than you guys do.
Honestly, he does. Like, it's his culture. He is a descendant, even though they try to claim that is not the case in so much of, or imply. It's really confusing. And part of the reason, I'm going to hold off on that again, too. He complains about the title of the book, which I felt wasn't strongly enough, frankly.
I do too. I mean, that honestly is one of my biggest issues, because a title of the book is a really important thing. That's how you grab your audience. That's how you market your book. That's how you kind of provide at least an idea about what the book is going to be about. And for him to make no effort to change it even after
it was made clear that the native people thought it was racist.
Yeah, it seems almost blatant to me. And I don't know that at this point he could even claim ignorance, because he was told multiple times by multiple...
Well, he wrote it in his book.
Yeah.
So you can't claim ignorance.
Right, yeah. And so it's just blatant disregard for an indigenous community, which, again, erasure.
Yep. There's one quote from an indigenous person in the very last chapter. They're not Muskegean, though. I think they were Mayan descendants.
Yeah,
which
I think
is
so.
Yeah. The author of the blog post, and we did both, acknowledge how sharply critical Preston was of the genocide, and he calls it genocide in the book, which is a good step forward. So, we want to give him props when he does that kind of thing well, because he did straight up say that this was awful, it shouldn't have happened.
Considering some of the language choices he had made in the book previously, for him to use the term genocide actually surprised me.
Right, because the American government doesn't call it genocide, at least not in America.
And there had been several times where he said, oh, I know that this is not the correct wording anymore, this is not the correct phrase anymore, but I'm going to use it anyways. So for him to finally kind of make that choice and make it correctly, I was like, okay, all right, I'll give him that.
So the author sums up the indigenous erasure section very nicely here with a quote. It doesn't matter that much how sympathetic Douglas Preston is to the indigenous people of Muskegean, past or present. What matters more is whether they are actually part of the story he tells, and they aren't. They are so tangential to Preston's story that they don't need to be mentioned at all throughout the start of the book or in the vast majority of the chapters. They don't need to be named, quoted, interviewed, visited, or consulted. And the repeated claim of the book that the city of the Jaguar was, quote, lost, even though local people knew it was there all along. Yeah, that summed it up pretty well. And again, we felt that.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you sent that article to me, I was like, oh my gosh, this guy, is being so negative. There's no way that this book is this bad. And now we're like, oh, actually.
Right.
So unfortunate, but not unwarranted review.
Yep. The next section he covers is what he calls academic unseriousness. I feel like this does him a bit of a disservice, the way he chooses to phrase this. I think I know what he means, but when I first read this without, reading it too closely or understanding exactly what he was saying, I took it to mean it wasn't a research paper and that's what he wanted to be reading.
That's kind of what I thought as well. And yeah, I think the phrasing matters in this sense because it could be read as saying like, oh, this book is too plain languagey. I don't know what the word would be, but like it almost can come across as being like, oh, this wouldn't fit in my ivory tower.
He's being elitist is what it comes off immediately unless you read what he's saying carefully.
Right. But that's not what he's meaning.
He's not. It is not. So he complains it's sensationalist. He has a little interesting tangent complaining about journalists who write books on topics like this. And I think he makes a good point in general here, although we have seen one case where I think he does pretty well with avoiding some of these pitfalls. But he feels like if an expert of the region was to write a book on this topic, they would have spent years working on it and studying it and getting involved with it. Whereas a lot of journalists in this author's view tend to kind of skip from one topic to another and kind of does surface level stuff but gives you a feeling of deeper knowledge. He specifically says they tend to be susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is the idea that you have a little bit of knowledge and you overestimate how much you know.
Yeah.
Which actually I think we can claim was one of our criticisms of studying history as well.
Yeah.
Because at the end he had solutions and we were like, most of the solutions were not very good.
Yeah.
We felt like.
Right.
So I think even though we liked that book a lot, I think that author, and he clearly had done a lot of work on this.
And in that case, I think it was just very idealistic and not having enough of, like you said, enough of the information about how the realities of archaeology and, the black market and things like that to really understand what was possible.
Well, the reason he's bringing this up in particular is because he's apparently done his legwork looking into Douglas Preston's authorship. And from 2012 to 2015, Douglas Preston authored 12 books.
Wow.
He does acknowledge that many of them were co-authored.
I know he does write a lot of like mysteries or something. I don't know what his like genre is.
But that's he's mostly fiction.
Okay.
But the point is that's a lot. I mean, he's very prolific. That's a lot of books.
Yeah.
He also does note that from 2015 to 2017, he slowed down but still wrote 2 books. And so that could have been the period he was writing this book and doing a lot of research, but he still managed to write 2 books in that period. That's a lot.
Yeah.
And so this basically what he's doing is kind of building a case for his criticism that he doesn't feel like Preston spent enough time on the subject. And importantly, for the academic and seriousness bit, didn't do his research.
Right.
And didn't really dive into that research deeply, which is the criticisms that were levied against him in the book, and then he never addresses, really, except, that's all he does.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I get that this was probably a really exciting thing for him, and he was writing from his point of view, and it almost comes off as like almost like a passion project, but it's so one-sided that it seems, I don't want to say like cheap, but just rushed almost.
Yeah.
Like, and that might explain why too, because like he does just kind of ramble. And I'll be honest, full disclosure, I have not read any of his other books. I haven't really read too many of his articles. We've read a few for this, but I've noticed even in the articles, he does tend to kind of ramble, and that might be his style. And maybe that's just not the style for me, but to me, it just comes off as rushed.
Yeah. So his criticism here is, like I said, how little evidence of scholarly research Preston has done. It doesn't mean that he has to write a dry report for us, but he needs to show us that he got his knowledge.
Yeah, there has to be some substance.
Did his legwork. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we saw this in another case. He says that he used extensive academic literature in one of his articles. In the book, or he says that, we saw an article being critical of Preston where they did an edit at the end saying he says he used it a lot in this other article. You read that article.
There was really nothing in that article that wasn't in the book. And it's essentially just name dropping of 2 archaeologists that have done work in this region, but it doesn't state what projects they have worked on, what sites they've worked on. on what years they
Doesn't
were
give
there.
any sense that he read what they've done.
No, it doesn't. And I feel like you can't say that without having some more information included in the article about like some specifics about what they've worked on.
Right. And so he keeps saying this article has this, but it clearly doesn't.
No.
I hate to throw around the L word, but it feels like a lie.
Honestly, that specific article, it was just a rehashing of this book. Like I was reading it and I was like, wait, I think I've read this in the book. And it ended up being just quotes by some of the art. He just requoted some of the stuff that was quoted in the book. But even still, a lot of the wording was just the same. It really was just a summary of this book. It even had at the beginning.
At the table.
I'm sorry. It even had, the pedigree of all the old dead white dudes and stuff in it, but just a little bit shorter. So
yeah,
I don't know.
I'm real hesitant to accuse someone of intentionally deceiving, but I don't know what else to do there with that information right now. The author of Did You Talk to the Locals notes the constant contradictions about the lost nature of the site. And I thought he understated this a little bit, because I was constantly having whiplash with contradictions in what he was saying, and then he'd say something that implied a different thing later. But yeah, there's phrasing in there that would tell you that he knows people knew about it and were nearby, and then he keeps calling it lost and newly discovered and things like that tells us the exact opposite.
Yeah.
And that's bad writing.
Yeah, you can't have it both ways.
No. An argument we had, he acknowledges at some point, I think it was talking about civilization, but he does this a couple times where he says, oh yes, I shouldn't use this, but I'm going to. Again, the author of Did You Talk to the Locals here says, Preston claims he agrees with, quote, most of the arguments around the terminology of, quote, discovery, and uses the words like, quote, lost, but then he claims it poses a challenge for those of us writing about archaeology for a lay audience, because you can't avoid using those words without tying the English language into knots. The author here says it is absolutely absurd that Preston would acknowledge these arguments and claim he mostly agrees with them, only to then ignore them throughout his entire book. It is actually quite simple to avoid this problem by using simple words in English. Local people clearly visited and knew about the site, so it was not lost to them. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the kind of sentence Preston needed to write, which I think successfully avoids tying the English language into knots. Instead, he wholeheartedly embraces calling the site lost from the title of the book onward.
To me, he can try and use the excuse that he's writing for a general audience. And he is, obviously.
Right.
But first of all, your general audience is not stupid. Like, they're able to comprehend this stuff. And also, that's the excuse he uses, but I don't feel like that's what he's really doing. I feel like he's trying to use language that serves his purpose, that makes it exciting and enticing and makes it sound more adventurous than it might have been. I don't know. Like civilization and those words, they just kind of smack of like that old colonialistic white explorer guy coming in to conquer the land,
It feels lazy.
Yeah.
It feels like there's a certain brand of comedians now that will say, oh, you can't make jokes anymore because people get too offended, when there are plenty of great comedians not constantly offending people.
Yeah.
And then they say the things anyway and they don't care. So it's disingenuous and it's lazy.
Yeah. And honestly, with the word acrobatics he was doing, it would have just been easier to write simplistically and
you can write an engaging story and talk about the people who knew it was here and what it meant to them, and you can do that if you talk to them.
It would be fascinating.
It would have been amazing.
Yeah.
The author of Did You Talk to Locals does pick up on one thing I think we missed anyway, and that Preston keeps using the term post-conquest, but he says very specifically the Spanish never conquered Mesquite, but he keeps using the phrasing post-conquest.
Oh, I did not pick up on that.
That's a good point. I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah.
But that's absolutely right. Like, that needs to be rephrased, or, there's other ways you can say that.
Yeah.
Post-contact, for one, would have been an easy way of doing that, and it doesn't tie the English language into knots.
Yeah. I do wonder why he chose post-conquest, because coming from an archaeological background, most people do use post-contact. So that's interesting.
Probably more dramatic.
Maybe, yeah.
He notes that Preston undermines indigenous claims to the area rather than address their criticisms itself.
Mm-hmm.
Here's one thing I didn't agree with this author, although Preston did this in some other cases where we did have problems with it. He says Preston casually referred to how humans first walked into the Americas 15 to 20,000 years ago. Then he blithely adds an asterisk, stating in a footnote that this claim is much disputed. And he's really upset that he included this at all, or he points out, you could have just said, first humans possibly entered in at this time frame. They wouldn't have to do any of that. And that's fair, although I think that's a pretty minor case of him doing that. There were some more egregious ones where a researcher said, do not say this, and he said it anyway and added it as a footnote.
Right.
They said not to say this.
And I feel like that was almost purposeful. Not everybody reads footnotes.
Yeah.
So
in those cases,
yeah,
I feel like
some readers would have just brushed right over that and not realized that. And I think that's really unfair to the person he was quoting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really was disrespectful to the person he's quoting. Sure. The author of Did You Talk to Locals goes after him for quoting Jared Diamond twice. He ends this section with, I never expected The Lost City of the Monkey God to be an academic book. It's clearly not, and not every book needs to be. However, if Preston had a goal of sharing archaeological knowledge with the general public through his book, he should have put a lot more time, care, and effort into that job. Instead, his shallow and flippant mentions of academic scholarship and criticism are utterly incomplete and unserious.
Well, and that's the thing too, right? Like, this is different than a fiction book. When you're writing about archaeology, you inherently have to include facts.
Yeah. I didn't go on about this, but he did, the author of this blog post did go on about how there are academic criticisms of his work and the project, and he doesn't address those, right, which we'll see again.
That is definitely his MO.
Yep. And then we finish with the section he titles Lessons, and this is essentially him criticizing the work, the writing itself. And his big point is, he says, if I was grading the book like I grade an AP essay, the biggest question I would ask my student would be, what is your thesis? What is the general argument you're trying to make? As far as I can tell, Douglas Preston doesn't have one. There is no real argument he's making in his book, whether it is about the best methods for advancing archaeological knowledge, the meaning this archaeological site should hold for the people of Honduras, or anything else. Instead, Preston is merely interested in telling a story, or rather a string of loosely connected stories, and tossing a variety of interesting facts and details into a story to keep the readers entertained. Yeah.
And that was one of our biggest issues in just reading it in general. I mean, like you said, whiplash.
and things that were implied to have, big payoffs, didn't go anywhere. Like they had to set the equipment up in that field.
And, they're going to steal it.
And then nothing happened. It didn't happen. Like,
yeah. Well, and then like the leishmaniasis thing, like I get it, but it went on for way too long, in my opinion. You could write an entire, like if he could have written an entire book about that alone. And that would have
been sufficient.
Yes. But it although he might have found it interesting, and I'm sure readers found it interesting, it detracted from the very, and I use this term loosely, the point, quote, point of the book. Because I don't know what the point was.
Right. There wasn't one. The author of this blog post does talk about that too. He also picks up on a thing we didn't note, which is that Preston cites a book called The Hot Zone, which he fails to mention is written by his brother, Richard Preston.
Oh.
And this is a pattern the blog author sees of Preston distancing himself from other works. Like when people are criticizing his articles in National Geographic, he says the article in National Geographic rather than my article. He doesn't seem to take ownership of it when he's taking criticism of it. And in this case, if you're promoting your brother's book, kind of have an obligation to let the reader know that you're doing that.
Yeah.
And what are the sources he cites in this? Two of them are Jared Diamond's books we know are not have problems.
Right.
And the other one is his own brother's books, which according to the author of this blog, I haven't looked into it myself, was also heavily criticized. His brother's book was. So what do you do with that?
Right. And then and then you put on top of that the fact that he said that, oh no, in another article I wrote, I reference these archaeologists that did extensive work there and talk about the work they did, and he does not.
He doesn't talk about the work they did at all. Right. He just talks about how they didn't like
it. So yeah, in that article, I was expecting to see a link to maybe the archaeologist's website or something that, they did a lot of work here, blah, blah, blah. blah, talk about it briefly, and then link to their website to tell me more about what they've done.
Yeah,
and there was none of that.
Even without that, here they've done a lot of work. I forget, is it Chris Begley?
Mm-hmm.
Chris Begley, who is mentioned in the book, but it's never really clear that, Chris Begley has been working in the Mesquite region for 20 years.
Right. No, it's not at all. When you said he was mentioned in the book, we had to go back and look.
Right.
Like, he wasn't a character, really.
And basically Begley is one of the critics of the book and the articles and everything. But again, his rebuttals to Begley's critiques are weak and unconvincing. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so that kind of summarizes, I felt, very nicely our complaints overall. This blog post, I will definitely include this one as a link for folks if you want to look at it yourself. But it ends with talking about the writing itself, and I think that leads us pretty nicely into one of the articles you found, Barbara, that is more new information than I think most of what we found.
Yeah. So this, I guess, was a blog post written by someone named Jason Colavito. I hope I'm saying that right. And he's an author and a scholar. He's written numerous books. He talks a lot about fringe theories and the ancient histories and extraterrestrials and all those pseudoscientific things. So he's kind of versed in that stuff as well. And he is a journalist as well and has written extensively. So one of the things he noted was just essentially the lack of journalistic integrity. He actually calls the book he calls it straight up a bait and switch, because it's actually not about the lost city, as the title suggests. Points out that Preston essentially falls victim to his own biases, and he ends up creating a chronicle of his own blind spot in the process. And, he talks about how he inserts himself and he becomes very too engaged in it, rather than looking at it from a journalist's perspective and looking at it as an outsider to write about it and essentially chronicle what's going on. He chronicles himself and his experiences, which is fine to a certain degree, but he obviously lets his own personal feelings kind of frame his writing, right?
And frame his arguments and rebuttals too. That's why we have problems.
Yeah, exactly. And that was one of his biggest things was, he doesn't address any of the criticisms. He kind of brushes it off. He starts to take this very personally, defensively wise. But he says, let's state this up front. This is not a book about the lost city of the monkey god. It is not a book about the white city. It is not really even a book about archaeology. To my mind, it is a, quote, book, mostly in the technical sense that it has a large number of uneven chapters fronted by a table of contents and backed by a useless list of sources unlinked to specific facts within the book. In terms of its content, however, it is not an analysis of the legend of the white city, a carefully researched account of Honduran archaeology, or even an adventure tale, which I thought that was interesting because that's how I kind of took it. But
that's the positive thing I have for it. When it is the adventure tale, it's more, I find it more enjoyable.
Yeah, but he says it's a bait and switch. He lures the reader in with the promise that he will describe the discovery of the white city, but then he delivers an endless account of hardship of tracking through the Honduran rainforest and a bunch of rants about the expedition's critics, and he, calling them jealous and bitter. And then I thought this was great because I was like, yes, thank you. I'm not the only one that feels this way, he said. And the third of the book devoted to more detail than I ever cared to know about the leishmaniasis.
There's been a couple comments on that, yes.
But yeah, I was like, wow, I could not have summarized my feelings about this book any more accurately. But I think it is interesting too, because I know, he's a journalist and stuff, and I never really thought of it from the ethics pertaining to journalism and how he essentially could be seen as walking a very gray area there. Like, he's obviously reporting this chronicle and he is reporting on stuff that happened, but the injection of his own opinions and biases and things like that weaken any argument.
You'll always have some, but there's no attempt to mitigate or address them.
Right.
He doesn't show us he's aware of his own biases even.
Yeah. Like, he just He never says he's aware of them. And then when somebody does criticize what they're doing, he just calls them jealous.
He defends, but because he's not aware of his own biases, he can't step back and say, okay, is there any merit to the criticism?
Well, and there's, he kind of thinks of himself as part of the team.
Yep. 100%.
And he's not or shouldn't be, essentially. He should be an outsider observing.
Another one that had a bit that was new and was a really good article that I think I might also link in particular is titled, "Did a Recent Expedition Really Discover a Lost City in Honduras?" This is by Laura Clark, and this is in the Smithsonian Magazine. And so this is an article kind of all about the controversy, and I noted that this article was better about citing its sources than anything in the book or any of Preston's articles, because it actually has a good number of like links to here's a thing, here, it letting you read more if you want to.
That's what I expected with Preston's article.
Right. So it can be done. This is where I noted it says Chris Begley has been working in the region for 24 years, not 20 years, but 24 years. But then kind of a little disheartening thing we discovered doing the research. We've ultimately come down and been a little disappointed about Chris Fisher.
Our hero has fallen a bit.
A little bit. I'm not going to straight up condemn him or anything, but I'm a little disappointed with some of what I'm seeing. In the article, Chris Fisher is quoted saying, in response to the criticisms, he pointed out specifically that the area was unoccupied and relatively undisturbed. Relatively undisturbed, which doesn't mean that no one's been there.
Right.
When they came upon it that way, they never said it's Ciudad Blanca or the city of the lost monkey god, which I feel is disingenuous because, yes, he can say, I never said that, but they're talking about the National Geographic articles here, which very heavily implied that it was.
Yeah.
That they were saying it was. The whole lost city jargon and stuff is very much present in that article.
Yeah.
So I was unhappy. And then you can find like a TED Talks with Chris Fisher. I got to specify because we got another Chris we're talking about too. There's TED Talks he's done. And I was disappointed that he was using a lot of that kind of lost city, unoccupied jargon in those situations too. And that wasn't, it's a TED Talk. So it's not just two idiots sitting around a microphone spouting their mouth off like you got here. He had to prepare that and have that ready to go. Another thing I noted was he can avoid that jargon because I looked at some of his professional reports and he's not doing a deep dive into the culture of the region or anything. He is concerned with the LiDAR, and that's fair. That's his specialty and everything. So he's talking about the LiDAR results and stuff. But in those reports, they very clearly are avoiding the lost city jargon in the professional reports. So he can do it, which implies that he knows he should, but he still is. And that makes me very disappointed.
Well, and I know Chris Begley in one of his articles, he mentions that this La Ciudad Blanca or White City or whatever you want to call it, has been discovered by numerous outsiders over and over again. Numerous sites have been claimed to be White City, and the myth itself is really doesn't show up until Spanish exploration. Not that something like that didn't exist within the indigenous community, but it's kind of been changed and turned into this mythical land, kind of on par almost like with Atlantis or something. He says a lot of people talk about it as if it's this like impenetrable forest, and they have this conquest attitude, like you have to be a tough guy and brute force is necessary to get through it. And he's like, that's not true. But he wrote an article called "The Lost City That's Not Lost, Not a City, and Doesn't Need to Be Discovered." Mm-hmm. And I like that title too, just because it doesn't need to be discovered. No. I think is a really important kind of, we talk a lot about research questions and things like that. Like, what was even the research question for this?
Yeah, and we acknowledged that there may have been one, we just aren't getting it from Preston's point of view. Like Fisher and the archaeologists involved, I suspect they had one.
And there were other researchers out there that were just very briefly mentioned in the book. And I would have, as I mentioned prior in prior episodes, I would have loved to learn more about what they were doing. doing because it sounded fascinating. And full disclosure as well, I didn't watch the documentary.
No.
It's behind a paywall. So just, I feel like that's important to disclose as well. I don't know what is included in the documentary or of what quality it is or anything like that.
Well, this ties into another resource from Chris Begley, actually, which is his website, which, again, I will link it because this was linked in the Smithsonian article, is how I got there. And in 5 minutes, I had more information about Mesquitia, the region, and the cultures involved than I got from the entire book.
Yeah.
His website is very good. He also touches, like you said, on how the term impenetrable jungle amuses him in this case. But it didn't occur to me that until now that, that might be the fact that it was still presented that way in the book is kind of a problem as well.
Yeah.
It's in a similar way other things were.
Yeah.
Because it isn't maybe accurate.
Well, and I think Chris Begley, since there's numerous Chris's, he does a really good job too in this article of talking about like what archaeology is.
Mm-hmm.
It's not what you find.
Right.
It's what you find out. And I loved that quote.
That's one of our major through lines.
Like if we're talking to a member of the public and that is all we can get them to understand, we feel like it's a win.
I've developed some specialized little stories just to get that across.
Yeah. Because like, yes, the artifacts and things like that they're tools for us to understand the past.
And we think they're neat too.
Yeah, they
I'm not going to say we don't, but they aren't the purpose.
Right.
They're not the point.
And he talks a lot about how technologies such as LiDAR and other technologies that we use make it easier to assume you found something new when in reality, unless you talk to the people that live there, whose culture, that area is part of, you don't know that it's new or not. And you can learn so much more.
I want to talk about Chris Begley a bit more too, but I wonder if part of the problem with, it feels like Chris Fisher is not acknowledging that we need to talk to the locals and there is information to be gained there sometimes when I've heard him talk anyway. And I wonder if we aren't seeing a bit of his bias as the guy who does the LiDAR technology. That's what he's focused on. That's what he wants to do. That doesn't involve talking to the locals.
Right.
And I feel like that could be it wasn't always expressed very well when people were quoted in the book. I'm not saying he quoted them incorrectly, but there were some reservations with it as a new technology, but not the be all and end all. Which it's not.
And to be fair, within archaeology, there are people that specialize in just utilizing a specific type of technology, and they'll be part of a team.
Yes.
And there may be somebody else on that same team that is more of the cultural anthropologist that will go out and speak to these people. And ideally, you would put all that information together.
Yes. And they had the anthropologist doing some of that in the book, at least. It was implied. We would have liked a little more in detail on what she was doing, but I think.
Yeah, it was a she.
But, and I was just thinking about that could explain a bit of why his focus is so much on the technology, which that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And there's nothing implicitly wrong with utilizing technology. It's just how you utilize it and what combination of other things you utilize it with.
Well, and there's nothing wrong with that being your focus and all you write about. But if you're going to talk about other aspects of the site, as in it was lost and we discovered it, you need to try and address your potential biases in there and realize that, it's probably not.
Yeah.
Another really good piece of information. I didn't go through Chris Begley's website in full. It's got a lot of great information if you want it, but I found it interesting. He didn't directly address the book or the project we are discussing, but he did indirectly address it in a few ways. One of them was a whole page titled Researchers Who Worked Here, and it lists 71 people who worked in the Mesquitia region. This undiscovered, unexplored, unresearched region.
Well, and in the book, he mentions multiple times that there really hasn't been any extensive work done here. Nobody is willing to come out here because it's so remote. And obviously that's not the case.
But then he contradicts himself in the book too. I noted that they were looking at the LiDAR image of their site they went to visit, and they had what they called the bus mounds because it looked like a bus to them on the LiDAR. And then we were like, that's a thing you do. And then they're flying out to the site, and he looks out the window at this well-documented, publicly accessible site, and he notices bus mounds there. And he doesn't think, oh, maybe someone's already done the research and knows what these are then.
Yeah.
Because it would ruin the mystery, it feels like. So, yeah.
I almost feel like he was, I wonder how much of this was just lack of research and how much of it was purposeful to make it seem more adventurous. I have to wonder, based on what we've seen with his articles and things like that, was he trying to intentionally mislead, or is it just not well researched, or he didn't care, or whatever?
Yeah, and when I've been slowly souring on this more and more as we go. I've always tried to give the benefit of the doubt. I'm not going to assume this was intentional. But as we go further and further and look more into this and how he keeps saying the same things in the articles and how he says he did a thing in this article and then we see he didn't, I start to kind of wonder.
Yeah.
And it's hard to let it go.
And I just hate that idea of an author like purposefully misleading their audience just to get a good story.
You're right.
I don't like that at all.
Yep. There was one other thing. This is something we've talked about, but I wanted to make sure we talked about it a bit more because it's been mentioned a couple times. It was mentioned in the first article we talked about. Did you talk to the locals? The idea that you have to do certain things to make a book a publicly accessible book.
Mm-hmm.
And I take a very, and maybe this is some of my own biases here, of course. I'm very personally, professionally insulted by that implication.
Yes.
It is our jobs to specialize in archaeology and in presenting this information to the public. And I can tell you, listeners, that we can take the most mundane act to the people we're talking to. Like everyone here is sick to death of hearing about the turpentine industry that was really big in our region. We can take these subjects and we can present them in such a way that is accurate and fair, and people are excited about it.
Yeah.
You can take any mundane subject and make it something fascinating if you're talking about the past, if you present it in a way that's talking about the people and what it meant to them and all these other aspects that help people see things in a way they may not have, as opposed to what we're doing here, which is just validating what people already assume is true.
Yeah.
I have just one other thing to mention, unless you have something else you want to talk about, Barbara.
For one other thing about this article,
or no,
Okay.
the subject for today.
Okay, I was hoping I was actually just going through my notes trying to find some more positive things, because I really don't want to just like we said before, beat the dead horse or completely bash this author, but it's becoming difficult.
The most positive I read, the most thoughtfully positive I read, was in the article Did They Talk to the Locals, and that was the most positive I read, that like it was actually thinking about what was going on.
Yeah.
For me, what did you find?
Well, I mean, I really didn't find a ton. I would say, yeah, that was probably the most thoughtful. A lot of the book reviews that were not necessarily reviewed by archaeologists or, they were just laypersons or other authors and things like that, really did enjoy his adventure stories. But then, of course, as Chris Begley points out, is it really an adventure story?
Right.
So
Parts of it was, I would say.
I did find some very interesting, one person was had an article that was written about the Honduran banana industry and the history there.
Mm-hmm.
And then they cited this book because of that, one little tangent about the banana industry in Honduras. And I was thinking to myself, if I was a professor grading that paper and I traced back that citation to this book, that would have been points off, because that's not what this book is about. You can maybe take this book and be like, oh, he wrote about it. Let's see what his citations were.
If he cited anything.
Right. If he cited anything.
He doesn't necessarily have to for this kind of book, but it would have been helpful.
Right. But, or at least get the information and then trace it back to an article somehow by Google or something. But they didn't do that. They literally cited this book as a reference for the Honduran banana industry's history.
And the reason you can't do that, folks, for a research paper is because for all you know, in this context, this person just made it up.
Right.
Now, I don't think he did, but from a pure research, logical backing up your information source, you cannot say that he didn't.
Yeah.
So that's a big no-no.
Yeah. So I just found that interesting and, a little troublesome.
Yep. Okay. I think that wraps everything up pretty well.
I think so. I do think so.
Well, I want to, of course, we need to announce our next book, but before we fully wrap up, I want to point out that I found an interesting book that I think it might be worth considering. It's titled Lost City, Found Pyramid, Understanding Alternative Archaeologies and Pseudoscientific Practices. And the reason this book caught my eye is because two of the chapters, one of them, the author is Kenneth Fader, who we read and we liked his book.
Yes.
And the other one is Chris Begley. And there are other authors. I don't think it's quite a match for this podcast. I think it's very academic, and it's talking to archaeologists specifically about how we should be addressing pseudoscience. But if you all are interested in it and you want us to do it, let us know. And I think we can add it to the list, especially if enough people say they want to hear about it, because I kind of interested in it. It would be fun to hear from these guys in a different source as well.
Keep in mind too, Fader used his book in class as a textbook, and we really enjoyed reading that, and I think our audience enjoyed us going through it as well.
Yeah, this is one of those conglomeration books, though.
Yeah, it's like a series of essays.
They tend to be very, very academic.
Yeah.
And not always. So I'm just a little cautious because we've said we want to avoid that kind of thing typically.
But let us know, because we can
be pressured into doing what we want to do. So yeah, let us know on that. Otherwise, what is our next book, Barbara? Do you have it out? I don't know. I hope you did. We're not going to cut this part. You're on the spot now.
Oh, Tristan. Got it. The 9 Lives of Florida's Famous Key Marco Cat by Austin Bell.
Okay. So,
excited.
Yeah, this comes recommended to us by someone I know personally, and they work at the Key Marco Historical Society. I think I've got that name right. And this is a bit interesting because the Key Marco cat is the Florida state artifact, and March is Florida Archaeology Month. So it's a perfect time to launch a first episode talking about a Florida artifact. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think this is going to be a lot of fun to read this one. We looked at it and it's like 240 pages.
Yeah.
So if we were to do 80 pages-ish,
yeah,
wherever makes sense. Well, Barbara and I will work it out, but 80 pages-ish for the first one, and we'll plan on that.
And I am excited about this book because it should include information about the archaeologist who found the site in like the late 1800s.
Yeah.
And he was a character. So I'm so excited.
And these were like, you've heard us talk about how Indiana Jones is not a good archaeologist. These guys were pre-Indiana Jones. So it doesn't mean that there wasn't ever good archaeology for its time, but a lot of it was not good for its time. So this could be kind of interesting.
And I mean, it's a cool site.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating site. And I know this is about, I guess, the artifact, the one artifact, which is different for our podcast too.
Right.
But, and I think it'll do a good job, I hope, of showing like all that you can learn from a single artifact and why, like, yes, the artifacts and things are cool, but it's the information they provide. Yeah. So I'm hoping we can...
Because it's got an interesting history because it was in the Smithsonian for a long time, and now it's finally on loan back in Florida. So yeah, we'll kind of get its life at post-excavation at the very least, I think is a big part of the book, but maybe we'll get some information about what came from it too. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Me too.
And we'll see you all next time.
All right. Happy reading, everybody.
Archaeology Books for Fun is brought to you by the Florida Public Archaeology Network, a program of the University of West Florida. You can find out more about archaeology and about FPAN at fpan.us. We appreciate any feedback, so if you're listening to us as a podcast, please leave us a review, and if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thanks for listening.